But that's not the way learning really occurs. Learning occurs in bursts when you want to know it. When you either are so curious about it that you have to know it, you can't stop the person from learning, or you've reached a point in life where you need to know this. I did a study of learning to read in which I interviewed, these were not graduates, these were not students in Sudbury Valley, but these were families that have chosen what's called unschooling. So these are homeschooling families, but who don't provide a curriculum for their children at home. They allow their children to pursue their own interests. And they help the children pursue their own interests, and they help the children make contact with other children so the children are not isolated, help connect them to the community. So I did a study of how children in that situation learn to read. The parents don't teach reading, just like doesn't occur at Sudbury Valley. They don't force the children to read. They might help the child learn to read if the child asks for help, and the same is true at Sudbury Valley. So I did this survey of them, and also previous to that, some of my students at Boston College had done a little study of learning to read at Sudbury Valley. So I combined those two studies, and what we were interested in is how old was the child when they learned to read, and why did they learn to read? To the degree that the child could remember, to the degree that the parents could remember, and for the kids at Sudbury Valley to the degree that the staff members could remember. And the kinds of stories I would get were like this. So one young woman who had been an unschooled girl said that my mother would read to me at night. And she was reading the Harry Potter. And I got really interested in the Harry Potter. But my mother could only read for a certain amount of time. And I got impatient. I couldn't wait. And so I said, I'm going to finish this book. And I learned how to read. There was another who's, this was a little boy who liked to play, who liked to do things on the computer. And he would always ask his older brother to read the words for him. And at some point, his older brother said, I'm sick and tired of reading the words to you, and walked away. And that was when that little boy decided, well, I'm going to have to learn to read. So it's interesting that when people see a need to do it, and I have yet to find any person who's grown up in our culture at the Sudbury Valley School or in an unschooling situation who doesn't at some point see it would be really neat to be able to read.
The article you wrote about the whole and the parts, would that connect with this concept where you learn math as a whole, not as various levels? Could you tell us a little bit about
We're trying to teach, and we break it down into parts. We think this is the reasonable way to teach stuff. So, we start with the elements. It's like we're chemists. We're going to start with that. We're going to start with the atoms, and then we're going to work towards the molecules, and then we'll work towards the whole thing. So when we teach reading, the first thing is everybody has to memorize the alphabet and recognize the letters. And then we teach them the sounds of the letters. Nothing could be more boring than that, right? It has no meaning to the child, zero meaning to the child. So we teach them this, and then we gradually move from that to, in English, cat, C-A-T, cat, right? How interesting is that? But when children are learning to read on their own, that's not how they learn to read. They don't think of themselves ever as learning to read. This is an interesting thing. If you ask a child, what are you learning, you'll get a blank face back. Children don't think that they don't think of themselves as learning. That's adult language. Children think of themselves as doing things. Ask a child what you did today, and you may or may not get an answer. The child may not want to tell you what they did, but the child knows what he did. He doesn't know what he learned. Knows what he did. He'll tell you what he did. And what happens in childhood, and the way children learn in hunter-gatherer bands, at Sudbury Valley, in any natural setting, and children go to school, I would argue that most of their real learning is out of school, no matter how much they're going to school. They're learning not because they're sitting down to learn. They're learning because they're doing stuff. And the learning is a consequence of doing stuff. So a child learning to read never goes through a stage of learning to read. The child starts right off reading. In the child's mind, the child is reading. I could call it learning to read because as an adult observer. So let me give you, I can tell the story of my own son learning. Long after he could talk, he would point to a sign and say, what's it say? And I would say, exit. Because he had asked the question. I wasn't trying to teach him to read. I was just answering his question. So he was really reading. He now, every time he saw the sign exit, he would say exit. And then, and he learned that way. He would point to words. He wanted to know what that word said. He was teaching himself to read, but I don't think he would articulate that he was teaching himself to read. He would say, I'm reading it, and I don't happen to know how to read that word, so I want you to tell me it, right? That, it turns out there's been, these kids who are called precocious readers, it turns out there's actually been research, and they're not precocious in other ways. My son wasn't. You know, he's probably a little brighter than the average person, but there are people who are precocious readers who have just average IQs. They're not, in other ways, they're not geniuses. Their brains aren't any different from anybody else as far as anybody can tell. They're just people who, for whatever reason, got interested in reading. To me, that's pretty interesting. Learning to read can't be all that hard if a 3-year-old can do it, right, without being taught. And yet we make it so hard in school. But the point here is that for children who are learning to read, they don't think of themselves as learning to read. They start right off reading whatever they can. They are self-correcting. At some point they realize, well, I'm not actually doing it the way I see the other people doing it. I'm actually not. I'm not writing anything that anybody else can read. and I'm kind of missing the point of typing. And so therefore they start, and he goes through a number of examples of different ways that children learn. And I think that same thing, you know,
with a lot of land and a lot of free space to run and, you know, explore the environment. And that, of course, makes for a great environment for people to learn in, right? But more and more, all of us are at least in an urban setting where that kind of space is not easy to get. And for people like us at Quest, which is a rather tiny space, how do we ensure that there's enough that children get exposure to, so there is constantly something that's stimulating in the environment? And what's your take on technology? Is that a good part of this environment, or you know,